1 year later, September 11th, 2002, Ground Zero, New York City, pages 171 to 188. At first it had been exciting, like being famous. Certainly it was as close to being famous as pretty much anyone from Shanksville had ever been. There were news vans set up like permanent trailer parks surrounding the strip mine outside the school and along US Route 30. There were satellite dishes and food trucks and news people everywhere. There were people who just felt they had to come to see the sight of such a tragedy and pay some kind of respect to those who had died. There were the others, the conspiracy theorists, the morbidly curious, the wannabes, and the just plain crazy. And then there were the families and friends of the victims of 9/11 and Flight 93 who came almost immediately after the crash with whose swollen eyes were ringed with black circles, whose hearts were cracked open and torn apart. They had come looking for an answer, a story, or a piece of something, anything to take away with them. But there was nothing. No answers, no closure, nothing to take away. So instead they left something. They left stuffed animals, notes, ribbons, pieces of clothing, books, flowers, Bibles, flattened pennies, poems, photographs, jewelry, tiny trinkets. They tied their objects, their hearts, their sorrow, to the 40-foot-long chain-link fence that had been installed at the crash site. They wrote things on the tall whiteboards that had been put up for that purpose. All kinds of people, hundreds a day, driving down the roads that, a year ago, only had a few cars and a couple of kids on their bicycles had traveled. For a while, Will's sister set up camp on their front lawn just to give directions to all the visitors who inevitably made a wrong turn or two. They dragged out a folding table and chair and hung a sign, free directions. They took turns sitting there for weeks until the grass under their chair turned brown, until even they got overwhelmed by all the people, the endless stream of lost, broken-hearted, patriotic, curious people. So much pain it wore a path in the streets and across everyone's hearts, threatening to obliterate everything else. And this, the 1 year anniversary, only promised to bring more interlopers. It was an opportune time, Will's mother had decided, for the family to get out of town, far from Somerset County, away from the crowds that had taken over Shanksville. And where else to escape the crowds? To New York City. Seriously? But Will knew why his mother had wanted to come. She had been awarded tickets to the 9/11 memorial service for her charity work because she had spent the better part of the entire last year helping to set up the temporary memorial. She was in charge of cataloging every single item that was left behind or mailed to Shanksville. No object was too small or invaluable for her attention. Not a water-soaked matchbook, not a box of broken crayons, not an empty wallet with barely visible initials stamped into one corner. With each recorded memento of grief, Will's mother found hope, and Will's family began to heal. The heroes of Flight 93 affected Will's family in a different way than they might have affected someone else's family. The people in that plane were heroes in the most important way, making a choice, not knowing the outcome, but knowing that acting was better than not acting, doing the right thing because the right thing was what you were supposed to do. Only this time the whole country was mourning with Will's family. Rooney and Callie just seemed to be excited to be in New York City. They all had taken the train yesterday from Johnstown to Penn Station and found their room at the Milford Hotel right in Times Square. The entire day they had acted like regular tourists. They walked across along Broadway, craning their necks, looking up at the giant billboards and down at the rows of window displays, cameras, suitcases, New York, NYC memorabilia, clothing stores, makeup stores. On Fifth Avenue, there were entire stores devoted to just one designer, to sunglasses, to Nike, to the NBA, which of course Will wanted to go to and his sisters didn't complain too much about. If this was the only part of New York City a person came to, he might never know any different. The city was alive with shopping and sightseeing, smells of steaming hot dogs and salty pretzels on every block, vendors selling hats, selling pocketbooks, selling photographs. "Look, Mom," Callie stopped and pointed. A man sat on a tiny folding stool before a trifold display of photographs, mostly of the New York skyline. "These photos will be worth a fortune one day," the man took the opportunity to say. "Photos of the World Trade Center. I took them myself." Will scrunched up his face. It didn't seem likely. He had seen the exact same photo at another guy's booth a block away. "No, thank you," Will's mother said. This morning, Wednesday, September 11th, they had to be downtown by 8 o'clock. The reading of the names would begin at the exact time that the first plane had struck the first tower, 8:46. There were sure to be crowds. They were sure to have trouble with the subway map. They were sure to get lost at least once, so they left the hotel at 7 in the morning and arrived at Ground Zero in plenty of time. Some people will say that the distance a person happened to be from where one of the planes went down is in direct proportion to how deeply they were affected by the events of the day that came to be called simply 9/11. For instance, people who lived in Lower Manhattan were more a part of the tragedy than those who happened to be on the Upper West Side. Those who lived in Winchester County, or who were in school in upstate New York, or who called Seattle, Washington home. But that isn't true. And some people point to the number of deaths, more than 27,000 at the World Trade Center, 343 of them firefighters, 246 in 4 planes, 125 in the Pentagon, citizens from over 90 different countries. That doesn't quite tell the story either. Because in the end, it's just about people. Mothers, fathers, friends, foes, sisters, brothers, children born and not yet born, sons and daughters, people from all over the United States and then all over the globe whose lives would never be the same. Because the world changed that day, slowly, and then all at once. There were stories, so many stories. They started appearing immediately, everywhere in New York, stapled, taped, thumbtacked all over the city. Photographs and photocopies, flyers, letters, sticky notes, and desperate pleas. "Please, please, have you seen this woman, this man?" In the aftermath of the fallen towers, thousands of people were missing. Thousands. The city became a giant scrapbook, a living, breathing, weeping album of the missing. Every telephone pole, the side of every building, every tree had become a collage of faces, an entity to understand, to share, and to find the answers and mourn. Amy's mother hadn't been able to get a flight home to Los Angeles until that Friday. And when she did, she said it was like entering a military zone. At JFK Airport, Army personnel were everywhere. No one in line spoke above a whisper. Scheduled flights were delayed by hours. Security took an unprecedented length of time. The flight itself was terrifying. But on Saturday morning, when Amy woke up, her mother was standing in her bedroom doorway. And a year later, they decided that they all had to return together for the 1-year anniversary. Sergio was there, of course. Gideon had gotten him an extra ticket from the guys at Engine 209, Ladder Company 10, to attend the ceremony at Ground Zero instead of the roped-off area, right on the flat expanse of dirt where the Twin Towers once stood. Sergio needed to be there. He wanted to. So much had happened in a year. It wasn't going to be a holiday, not like President's Day or MLK Day, so there was still school that Wednesday. But it was called Patriot Day, and he was given permission to miss school. His grandmother wanted to go with him, and they both stood for nearly an hour before they could even get in. Apparently, a lady was going to play the flute, and one after another, relatives of those who were killed were going to walk up onto the stage and read the names, nearly 3,000 out loud. Many of Gideon's friends were among them. Gideon himself was going to be one of the readers. This last year, Sergio had spent a lot of time at the firehouse, and Gideon had even come to visit them at Red Hook. Sergio's grandmother made dinner, and the 3 of them stuffed themselves, and they watched Jeopardy on television afterward. Gideon helped Sergio with his homework, not that Sergio needed it. Gideon taught him basic first aid, and when Sergio had a test in biology, they studied together. And in a funny way, having Gideon in his life and knowing what had happened to the country made Sergio less angry at his father, less angry at the world. It had made him more afraid and less afraid, both. There was so much to mourn and so much to be proud of. So many reasons to be at this memorial. Nahida and her family were making the pilgrimage as well. all the way from Columbus, Ohio, even though they had been there had been days this past year when they had been afraid to leave their house. That afternoon, a year earlier, Nahid and her sister had walked home together, nearly 2 full miles. Uncle Aman and Aunt Judith were still there and wouldn't be able to leave for weeks. Nahid's father was pulling into the driveway. Her mother had also left work early. She rushed into the house with tears in her eyes. She pulled her daughters close and held them there. So many people, she kept saying. So many people. She had the look on her face of a pain that was not her own but was for the whole world. That look that almost all grown-ups seemed to express those following days. Nahid and Yuri listened to and watched the television, but it all seemed too horrible to be real and too far away to have any significant impact on them personally, until a brick came sailing through the air a few weeks later, breaking glass and landing on their living room floor. Until a Middle Eastern restaurant in Columbus was targeted by a firebomb. It's owned by Israelis, for heaven's sake, Nahid's father kept saying. Until a gas station attendant in New Jersey was shot, not a Muslim, but a Sakha from India, because he was wearing his traditional turban. And now Nahid's parents were taking them to New York, right into the belly of the beast, to grieve with the rest of the country, because her father vowed, "We are Americans and no one is going to take that away from us." For so many complicated reasons, there would never be another morning as simply beautiful as September 11th, 2001. People always talk about the weather when they don't have anything else to talk about, when the conversation is light or feels stilted, or someone is just too peaceful, lazy, or preoccupied to think about anything more taxing. But after that day, the weather and the way people remembered it became something more, something potentially more deceptive, and yet something much more meaningful, more fragile and rare, and even more beautiful. Wednesday, September 11th, 2002, was sunny, but not as clear, and the wind blew unrelentingly across Manhattan. Amy held tight to her mother's hand as they moved toward the crowds. Her father walked close behind them. They finally found a spot and stood for a while on the platform on Fulton Street with the other people who had also stopped walking, who had also come to be part of something larger than they were, something that drew them to this place, even though they knew no one personally who had vanished into the white clouded air that day. They couldn't get any closer without a ticket, and the streets were roped off for blocks. Below at the memorial, they could see those who were standing, the families of the victims, holding flags, clutching flowers, holding photographs, holding babies in the air, as if those looking down and those far above could see them and know and feel. "It could have been you, Mom," Amy whispered. But how many times had she wondered why and why not? Who gets a second chance? A third? A fourth? And why did someone else get none? It had taken Amy a while to find the kind of girls that she felt comfortable with in her new school, and it wasn't that Bridget and Vanessa were enemies or anything, but Amy didn't need that kind of drama, not after what she had been through. "I want to go down there," Amy said. The warm air blew persistently, as if trying to drive away the sunshine. Above the flag snapped the whips, and the croning of the wind harmonized with the steady sound of human crying. "That's just for family," her father said. "I know, but I just need to stand there, or get a little closer at least, for 1 second." For a full year, Amy hadn't wanted to let her mother out of her sight. She had nightmares and got stomach aches when her mother went away on trips. But now Amy let go of her mother's hand and headed toward the line of people inside the velvet rope. Her mother reached out to stop her. "Let her go," her father said. "We'll wait here, Amy," he called out. "We'll be right here. Don't be long." She turned back around once and nodded. She needed to let go, and needed to grab on, and she needed to stand directly in the center of the universe that almost wasn't.